For 137 years, he was the perfect unsolvable mystery. No face, no name, no confession. Just 5 victims, a handful of letters that turned out to be forgeries, and a fog so thick over the streets of Whitechapel that even the people who were supposed to be hunting him could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Jack the Ripper became something that crime stories rarely become, a permanent fixture of cultural mythology, the ghost that Scotland Yard could never catch, the phantom who made every subsequent theory about his identity feel like it was probably wrong. Then, a tattered silk shawl changed everything. Not a dramatic confession, not a deathbed letter, not some overlooked document that turned up in a sealed archive. A piece of fabric, stained and frayed, that had been passed from hand to hand for over a century before anyone thought to run modern genetic analysis on the material embedded in those stains. What the DNA extracted from that shawl revealed was not the brilliant surgeon, the famous artist, or the member of the royal family that generations of theorists had proposed. It was something far more unsettling in its ordinariness. A 23-year-old Polish immigrant who worked as a hairdresser in the same streets where the murders occurred, whose name had already appeared in the private notes of the senior detective who oversaw the entire investigation, and who was committed to an asylum in 1891, the same year the killing stopped. The science does not merely point at a suspect. It points at a man the police had quietly identified while the newspapers were still sending them on elaborate chases after phantom doctors and royal conspiracies. The question the DNA evidence raises is not simply who Jack the Ripper was. It is why a man the authorities suspected was allowed to continue operating for as long as he did. Before we get into the science, the suspect, and the institutional failures that made the whole thing possible, here is the question that sits underneath this entire story. What does it mean when the most famous unsolved mystery in criminal history turns out to have an answer that was sitting in a police file all along? The object that started everything. The shawl at the center of this investigation was allegedly found at the scene of the Ripper's 4th confirmed murder. Catherine Eddowes was killed on September 30th, 1888, in Mitre Square in the City of London, one of 2 women murdered on the same night in what became known as the double event. She was 46 years old, separated from her husband, and had been released from police custody just hours before her death, having been held earlier that evening for public drunkenness. The shawl, a silk piece with a distinctive pattern, was reportedly taken from the crime scene by a police officer who was present during the investigation. It remained in his family for generations, passed down as a dark curiosity rather than recognized as potential forensic evidence. Most experts who examined it during the decades it spent in private hands dismissed it as a probable fake. The market for Jack the Ripper memorabilia had always attracted forgeries, and without a clear, documented chain of custody from 1888, the shawl was treated with appropriate skepticism. In 2007, a writer named Russell Edwards purchased the shawl at auction. He was convinced it was genuine and willing to stake both money and professional credibility on proving it. What he needed was a scientist capable of extracting usable genetic information from a piece of fabric that was, at that point, more than 120 years old, contaminated by an unknown number of hands, and degraded by decades of storage under conditions that no forensic laboratory would have approved. He found Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist at Liverpool John Moores University, with specialized expertise in recovering genetic material from aged and compromised samples. The work that followed was not the clean, quick extraction depicted in television crime dramas. It was painstaking, technically demanding, and conducted under conditions that gave the team little confidence from the outset that anything usable would survive in the material. The science of reading, a century-old stain. The type of DNA that Dr. Louhelainen's team focused on recovering was mitochondrial DNA, commonly abbreviated as mtDNA. Understanding why this specific genetic material was the right tool for this specific investigation requires a brief explanation of what makes it different from the DNA most people are familiar with from crime investigations. Standard nuclear DNA, the kind that produces the profiles used in most modern forensic cases, is inherited from both parents and undergoes a mixing process with each generation. Mitochondrial DNA works differently. It is inherited exclusively through the maternal line. You received your mtDNA from your mother, who received hers from her mother, and that chain extends backward through the female lineage, without the mixing that occurs in nuclear DNA. This means that a person's mtDNA profile is identical to that of their mother, their maternal grandmother, their maternal great-grandmother, and every female ancestor in that unbroken line going back through time. For a historical investigation, this property is enormously useful. It means that a living descendant of a maternal line carries essentially the same mitochondrial genetic signature as an ancestor from many generations back. If you can identify a living person who descends through an unbroken maternal line from a relevant individual, you have a direct genetic comparison point to evidence collected more than a century ago. The first test the team ran was designed to verify whether the shawl was genuinely connected to the crime scene or a later fabrication. They located a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes through her sister's maternal line and took a reference sample. When that profile was compared against the DNA recovered from the bloodstains on the shawl, the match was confirmed. The shawl had been present when Eddowes was killed. The blood in the fabric was hers. That confirmation was itself significant. It transformed the shawl from probable memorabilia into documented physical evidence from one of the most studied crime scenes in history. The second finding was the one that opened the identification question. Within the genetic material recovered from the shawl, the team identified additional trace samples inconsistent with the victim's profile. The material appeared consistent with semen. This was potentially the perpetrator's own genetic signature, left on the fabric at the time of the attack. Here is something worth pausing on. You are looking at a piece of fabric from 1888, and somewhere embedded in its fibers is biological material that a human being left there in a moment of violence. The question was whether anyone alive today could be matched to it through a maternal line. The suspect, who was never really a secret, Aaron Kosminski, was not a name that emerged from the DNA investigation. He was already in the police files. Born in Kłodawa, Poland in 1865, Kosminski had fled with his family to England to escape the violent anti-Jewish pogroms that swept through the Russian-controlled territories of Eastern Europe in the early 1880s. The family settled in the East End of London, the area of the city that absorbed the largest concentration of Eastern European Jewish immigrants during that period. Kosminski worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel, the neighborhood at the center of the Ripper investigation, and lived within walking distance of every murder location. By the time the killings were occurring, Kosminski was already known to authorities as a deeply troubled individual. Contemporary accounts and later medical records describe a man suffering from severe auditory hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and what modern clinical assessment would likely categorize as paranoid schizophrenia. He was reportedly known for a violent hostility toward women. He was malnourished, reportedly refusing to eat food prepared by anyone other than himself, and lived in conditions of significant poverty. None of this is retrospective psychoanalysis applied to a historical figure for narrative convenience. These characteristics were known to the police at the time, because the police had already identified Kosminski as their primary internal suspect. Chief Constable Melville McNaughton produced a famous internal memorandum in 1894 that named 3 men as the leading candidates in the Ripper investigation. Kosminski was among them. McNaughton described him as someone with a strong homicidal tendency and a pronounced aversion to women, and noted that he had been committed to an asylum. The more revealing document was private rather than official. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was the senior officer who coordinated the day-to-day management of the Ripper investigation across its most active period. He was, by any measure, the man who knew the case better than anyone. After his retirement, Swanson acquired a copy of the published memoirs of his superior, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren. In the margins of the pages covering the Ripper investigation, Swanson added handwritten annotations. In the section relevant to the case, he wrote that the perpetrator was Kosminski, the man who was sent to an asylum, and noted that he had died there. The officer who ran the investigation privately recorded, in his own handwriting, that he believed Aaron Kosminski was the man responsible. That annotation stayed unknown until after Swanson's death, when the annotated book was found among his effects. When Russell Edwards's team tracked down a living female line descendant of Kosminski's sister and ran the comparison against the genetic material recovered from the shawl, the profile matched. The DNA investigation had arrived at the same individual that the senior investigative officer had privately identified more than a century earlier. Does that convergence settle it for you, or does it raise more questions than it answers? The science and the historical record point in the same direction. Whether that constitutes proof is a question worth forming your own position on. The world that made detection impossible. To understand why a man the police already suspected was able to continue operating, you have to understand what law enforcement actually looked like in Whitechapel in 1888. The East End of London in the late Victorian period was not a place that the city's more comfortable residents were required to think about very often. Whitechapel and the surrounding neighborhoods had absorbed wave after wave of immigrants fleeing poverty and persecution across Europe, and the result was one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. Over 900,000 people were packed into a few square miles of narrow, largely unlit streets, shared courtyards, and industrial buildings that backed onto canals and railways. The physical environment was hostile to investigation in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from the present. There was no electric street lighting in most of the area. The notorious London fog, a genuine meteorological phenomenon produced by river mist combining with coal smoke from thousands of domestic and industrial chimneys, could reduce visibility to a matter of feet. A man could commit a violent act in a back alley and walk into a crowd of hundreds of people within 60 seconds. Without witnesses, without forensic tools, without any means of establishing where a specific person had been at a specific time, that man was functionally invisible. The forensic science that modern investigation takes for granted simply did not exist. Fingerprinting as a forensic technique would not be formally adopted by the Metropolitan Police until 1901. More than a decade after the Whitechapel murders. Blood typing would not be developed until the early 20th century. The concept of preserving a crime scene, maintaining integrity of physical evidence, excluding unauthorized persons from the immediate area of discovery, was not an established practice. When a body was found, reporters and curious members of the public arrived within minutes. Evidence was handled, contaminated, and physically displaced before investigators had the opportunity to document it properly. The Metropolitan Police launched what was, by the standards of the time, a substantial response. More than 2,000 people were interviewed. At least 80 men were formally detained and questioned. Every investigative technique available was employed. The scale of the effort reflects how seriously the department treated the case. What it could not compensate for was the fundamental mismatch between available investigative methods and the kind of evidence a mobile, local perpetrator operating in conditions of near-zero visibility could leave behind. The women who were targeted reflect the specific vulnerability the Whitechapel environment created. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were all women living in extreme poverty, relying on irregular earnings to pay for basic lodging. The cheapest accommodation available was in common lodging houses, where a few pennies secured a bed for a night. Without those pennies, the alternative was sleeping in an alley. Late at night, in fog, needing money, these women had both the necessity to be on the street and the economic vulnerability that made a brief encounter with a stranger plausible. The perpetrator did not need to lure victims in any elaborate way. He needed only to be familiar with the environment and to understand how desperation operates. The media circus that derailed the investigation. The difficulty of the investigation was compounded by something that the senior detectives had no tools to manage: the invention of Jack the Ripper as a media phenomenon. The murders coincided with a period of rapid expansion in the London newspaper industry. Multiple daily papers competed aggressively for readership, and the Whitechapel murders provided exactly the material that mass-market journalism required: violence, mystery, a nameless perpetrator, and a series of escalating crimes that could be reported in daily installments. The coverage transformed what was, at its core, an investigation into the killing of impoverished women in a neglected neighborhood, into the defining public event of 1888. The infamous letter addressed to the Central News Agency, signed with the name that would become permanent in cultural memory, arrived during this period. It was written in a jaunty, taunting tone that contrasted dramatically with the seriousness of what had actually occurred, and it included details and language that served more as effective copy for newspapers than as genuine communication from the perpetrator. The vast majority of experts who have studied it in detail believe it was produced by a journalist, almost certainly connected to the Star newspaper, as a deliberate circulation strategy. It worked. The letter generated enormous public response and produced thousands of copycat communications that kept investigators occupied processing material of no investigative value. One letter was different. The document that became known as the From Hell letter arrived not at a newspaper, but at the home of the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, accompanied by a small cardboard box. Inside the box was half of a preserved human kidney. The letter, written in a distinctly different style from the Dear Boss correspondence, claimed the kidney had been taken from one of the victims and that the writer had fried and eaten the other half. Catherine Eddowes had had her kidney surgically removed by her killer. Medical examination of the preserved organ indicated it had come from a woman of approximately Eddowes' age with a kidney condition consistent with her documented health history. The medical establishment at the time was divided on whether the organ was genuinely from the crime scene or a macabre fabrication. The question has never been definitively resolved. What is clear is that while the public was captivated by the theatrical Dear Boss letters, the O From Hell letter represented something operationally different, a communication with physical evidence attached, from someone who had been at the scene. Meanwhile, the senior detectives, quietly building their list of credible suspects, were working with information the newspaper-reading public was never given access to. The people who actually believed Aaron Kosminski was the most likely perpetrator were not writing letters to newspapers. They were writing private memoranda and marginal annotations in books that would not surface for decades. When the killings stopped and why the canonical Ripper murders are typically counted as 5, Nichols in August 1888, Chapman in September, Stride and Eddowes in the same night in late September, and Kelly in November. After Mary Jane Kelly's death on November 9, 1888, no further murders were attributed to the same perpetrator. The cessation has generated as many theories as the identity question. Some researchers proposed that the Ripper had died, possibly by suicide. Others suggested he had been imprisoned for an unrelated offense. The emigration theory argued he had left England entirely. Some simply proposed that he had stopped of his own choosing, a possibility that serial crime research suggests is less common than it is sometimes assumed to be. Aaron Kosminski's timeline provides a specific answer that does not require any of those alternatives. He was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in February 1891, following increasing behavioral deterioration that his family could no longer manage. The date of his institutionalization falls neatly after the conclusion of the murder series. He remained in asylum care for the rest of his life, transferred eventually to Leavesden Asylum, where he died in 1919 at the age of 53. The alignment is not coincidental in the way that many circumstantial alignments in historical crime cases are. Kosminski lived in Whitechapel. He was known to be violent toward women. He was the senior investigator's private identification. His institutionalization corresponds to the end of the murder series. And now his maternal DNA line matches genetic material recovered from physical evidence connected to one of the murders. Chief Inspector Swanson, writing in the margins of his superior's memoir years after the investigation had concluded, noted that a witness who could have formally identified the perpetrator had refused to give evidence against a fellow Jewish man, a decision that was reported to have caused the witness psychological distress for years afterward. If that account is accurate, it describes an investigation that came within reach of a formal legal identification and was blocked by a witness's reluctance rather than a failure of investigative reasoning. The police, in other words, may have known who the Ripper was. They may have had a witness. They may have been unable to make the case stick in court because the witness would not cooperate. And then, when Kosminski's family arranged his commitment, the problem resolved itself through a mechanism that had nothing to do with the criminal justice system: the challenge to the DNA findings. The identification would be considerably more straightforward to accept if the scientific findings had been received without dispute. They were not. When Dr. Luhalainen's work was formally published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, it attracted criticism from several directions, and the most substantive criticism cannot be dismissed by pointing to the quality of the laboratory work. The contamination question is the central objection, and it is a legitimate one. A piece of silk that was handled by police at a 19th-century crime scene, then removed to a private home, then passed through multiple hands across generations, then sold at auction, and subsequently handled by a collector's team, has been exposed to the genetic material of an unknown number of people before any sterile procedure was applied to it. The DNA found in the fabric does not come with a timestamp. There is no way to determine from the material alone whether a given sample was deposited in Mitre Square in 1888 or during one of the subsequent decades of handling. The response to this objection from the researchers is that the mitochondrial profiles recovered are specific enough that random contamination matching the maternal lines of both the victim and the suspect represents an implausible coincidence rather than a likely alternative explanation. Critics argue that the chain of custody problems are severe enough that no conclusion drawn from the material can be treated as definitive without independent replication under conditions that cannot now be established. There is also a question about the specific mtDNA haplogroup identified in relation to Kosminski's descendant profile. An early report on the findings indicated a haplogroup designation that researchers subsequently disputed as implausible given what is known about the genetic history of Ashkenazi Jewish populations. This dispute was addressed in later publications, but added a layer of complexity to the reception of the findings. What the DNA evidence provides, considered honestly, is a convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same individual: the genetic analysis, the geographic proximity, the documented behavioral profile, the internal police assessment, and the temporal alignment of the institutionalization with the end of the murder series. No single element of that convergence is decisive on its own. Together, they constitute the strongest case for any specific identification that has been made across more than a century of investigation. Whether that constitutes a closed case or an extremely compelling probability is a judgment call, and it is one that the available evidence does not make automatically. This is the point at which you have to decide where you land. Do you think the combination of the DNA match, the police documentation, and the timeline is sufficient to close the case? Or does the contamination problem leave enough uncertainty that the mystery should remain formally open? The question is a genuine one, and it does not have a clean answer. Share your position in the comments. The debate has been going on since 2019, and the arguments on both sides are worth knowing. What this case actually tells us: Jack the Ripper became a cultural phenomenon for reasons that have very little to do with the actual events of 1888. The murders were brutal and they were terrifying, but they were not uniquely so in the context of violent crime in Victorian London. What transformed them into a permanent fixture of global mythology was the combination of the media environment, the absence of a prosecution, and the specific quality of the mystery that resulted. A case with a known perpetrator, a trial, a conviction, and an execution produces a different kind of cultural memory than a case that stays permanently open. The open case generates speculation, and speculation generates narrative, and narrative generates its own self-sustaining momentum. Every generation that encounters the Jack the Ripper story brings its own cultural preoccupations to it. The suspect du jour reflects whatever anxieties the investigating culture is working through at the time: class resentment, suspicion of immigrants, fear of professional authority figures, conspiratorial thinking about institutions. Aaron Kosminski does not satisfy any of those narrative needs particularly well. He was not educated, not powerful, not mysterious. He was a young man in extreme psychological distress, living in poverty, in an environment of extraordinary social pressure, in a period when no treatment existed for the conditions he was suffering from, and no support system existed to help him or the people around him. He was eventually committed to an asylum, where he spent the remaining 28 years of his life. The story of Jack the Ripper, as Aaron Kosminski, is not the story that the mythology wants. It is a story about a mentally ill man in a city that had no mechanism for helping him and whose victims were women that the same city had no mechanism for protecting. The environment that made the murders possible was not an accident of fog and gaslight. It was the predictable result of specific policy choices about who deserved support and whose safety mattered. That is a less compelling story for the purposes of ghost tours and thriller novels. It is a more accurate one. Whether the DNA evidence is taken as definitive or treated as strongly suggestive, the case built around Aaron Kosminski is substantially stronger than any alternative that has been seriously proposed across 137 years of investigation. The man who ran the original investigation privately identified him. The The timeline of his institutionalization matches the end of the murders. His profile, his location, and his documented behavior are consistent with every aspect of what is known about the crimes. The shawl, a piece of fabric that sat in private hands for more than a century while the legend of an unsolvable mystery grew around the case, may be the most important physical evidence from the Victorian era to have survived into the age of molecular biology. What it produced when examined under modern conditions is not certainty in the strict scientific sense. It is convergence, and after 137 years, convergence may be the closest thing to an answer that this case was ever going to provide. Based on everything the evidence presents, do you think the case is closed? And does it matter to you that the real answer, if Kosminski is the right identification, was sitting in a police file for more than a century, while everyone was arguing about royal conspiracies and secret societies? That gap between what the investigators privately knew and what the public was being told is the part of this story that still deserves a great deal more attention than it usually gets.